For the past couple of days, US President Donald Trump has been in China to meet with his counterpart Xi Jinping. The trip has been remarkably chummy. Trump has spent most of it gushing about how beautiful China is and complimenting his host. And he was apparently unable to extract any meaningful concessions, apart from, apparently, a commitment from Xi that China wouldn't supply weapons to Iran, something that Trump already claimed Xi agreed to last month, and that the Chinese government denied was even happening in the first place. This is probably a good thing from the perspective of anyone who wants to avoid a superpower conflict, but it's a pretty remarkable turnaround from Trump, who used to be incredibly hawkish towards China. So in this video, we're going to look at how Trump's policy has changed over time, and try and figure out what happened to Trump the China hawk. The next issue of our magazine is out very soon, with this issue focusing on all of the wars that Trump has been involved in during his second term, with each dot on the cover representing a different military intervention or strike. Inside, we run through each of the conflicts, from Venezuela and Iran to Yemen and Ecuador, as well as discussing what he's really doing. Pre-order your copy today at toolong.news. So, to appreciate just how dramatic this reversal has been, it's worth remembering quite how hawkish Trump used to be on the so-called China issue. When he first came onto the political scene in 2015, one of Trump's big talking points was China, to the extent that the 2016 election was sometimes framed as a choice between the confront China candidate in Trump versus a confront Russia candidate in Clinton. Trump's main bugbear was the fact that the US ran, and still runs, a large bilateral trade deficit with China. This has been happening since the 80s, but it really ballooned in the 2000s, and was running at about $350 billion when Trump took office in 2016. To remedy this, in January 2016, Trump suggested a flat 45% tariff on all Chinese imports. Obviously, this didn't actually end up happening, but the tariffs Trump did impose were nonetheless pretty severe, at least by modern standards. Trump began applying tariffs to an ever-expanding list of Chinese goods in July 2018. By the end of his presidency, Trump had imposed tariffs averaging about 20% on most Chinese imports. Throughout his term, Trump also imposed a number of sanctions on Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE, and of companies suspected of doing business in Xinjiang. Trump also took aim at Beijing's expansive claims in the South China Sea, where China claims something like 90% of the area via what's known as the Nine-Dash Line, based on an unofficial map by a Chinese cartographer from 1936. In December 2016, Trump tweeted, "Did China ask us to build a massive military complex in the middle of the South China Sea? I don't think so." And in 2017, Trump's Secretary of State-to-be, Rex Tillerson, suggested during his confirmation hearing that the US could deploy naval assets to, quote, bar China from accessing the artificial islands. Trump was also pretty hawkish on Taiwan. After his election victory in December 2016, Trump held a direct phone call with Taiwan's then president, the first between the leader of the island and a US president or president-elect since ties began in 1979. Trump also filled his administration with so-called China hawks, and signed the Taiwan Travel Act, allowing US officials of all levels to travel to Taiwan. In August 2020, just a few months before the election, Trump sent Health Secretary Alex Azar to the island, the highest level visit by a US official in decades. Trump also escalated arms sales, culminating in an $8 billion package, including 66 upgraded F-16 fighter jets in late 2019, which provoked retaliatory sanctions from Beijing against US arms companies. You get the idea. In his very first term, Trump was very hawkish on China. During the 2024 presidential election campaign, Trump essentially promised more of the same. He suggested a 60% flat tariff on all Chinese imports, and took a notably confrontational tone on espionage, warning Beijing that the FBI would, quote, hunt down any Chinese spies. Much like his first term, Trump also filled his administration with renowned China hawks, including, perhaps most notably, current Undersecretary of War for Policy, Elbridge Colby, who made a name for himself in Washington by arguing that the US needs to extricate itself from Europe and the Middle East in order to focus its strategic energies on China. In the opening months of his second term, it looked like Colby and co. might get their way. Trump said that he'd get the US out of Ukraine, and days after taking office, imposed a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports, which, thanks to a rapid tit-for-tat trade war after Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs, ballooned to something like 140% by May. But since then, Trump's policy and rhetoric towards China have become increasingly dovish. The tariffs were promptly reduced as part of a hastily negotiated trade truce, and Trump has spent most of his time since praising Xi as a great leader. In December, Trump's 2025 national security strategy avoided explicitly labeling China as America's foremost strategic competitor, and instead focused more on Europe. A month later, he upset even congressional Republicans by allowing Nvidia to sell its high-end AI chips in China, so long as the US government got a cut of the profits. Trump also slow-rolled a forced sale of TikTok, something he previously framed as an urgent necessity, and walked back an earlier threat to cancel visas for Chinese students studying at American universities. During the war in Iran, which some commentators suggested might be a way to indirectly undermine China, Trump then took pains to avoid upsetting Beijing. After CNN reported that China was sending weapons to Iran, Trump reacted by merely sending Xi a letter asking him to stop, and said on Truth Social that he was planning to open the Strait of Hormuz for China. Ahead of this week's summit, where, as we noted in the intro, Trump took a conspicuously dovish tone, the US also delayed final approval of a $13 billion military aid package for Taiwan. So why has Trump changed his tone? In other words, what happened to Trump the China hawk? Well, Trump's chumminess with Xi is sometimes chalked down to his well-documented affinity for strongmen. There might be something to this, but we also see at least two more structural reasons for this pivot. The first is that, contrary to what Elbridge Colby might have hoped, the US has proved incapable of extricating itself from Europe and the Middle East. While Trump has withdrawn most support for Ukraine, he's been unable to end the war and has apparently got stuck in another open-ended conflict in the Middle East, this time with Iran. At the same time, Trump has started taking more of an interest in the Western Hemisphere, which has left the US without the strategic bandwidth to mount a meaningful challenge against Chinese influence in Asia. Second, and relatedly, is that this is clearly a reaction to last year's trade war, when Trump's rhetoric started to change. As you might remember, China reacted to Trump's Liberation Day tariffs by restricting the export of rare earths, elements which are crucial for most modern technology. Unfortunately for Trump, China utterly dominates in both their production and refining, which is why this prospect sparked panic in America's business community. This proved that China does indeed have leverage over the US, contradicting Trump's long-held belief that their imbalanced trade relationship had fundamentally given the US the upper hand. Greenland. For decades, it's been viewed as little more than a giant ice sheet on the edge of the world. A massive ice fortress that most of us only ever saw from 30,000 feet on a flight to somewhere else. However, that ice is receding, and as it does, the world's superpowers are beginning to move in. At TLDR, we've spent almost 10 years explaining things from behind a desk, but some stories are too big for our studio. So to understand why this island, and the Arctic more generally, has suddenly become the most valuable real estate on Earth, we had to go there. As you'll soon discover though, this isn't just a political briefing hosted from the cold. We're hiking through the wild, discovering melting icebergs, and uncovering the rusting remnants of secret military projects abandoned in the snow.
I used to think I understood what cold was, but I was lying to myself.
Over 3 episodes, we're asking, what's the big deal with Greenland? From the scramble for rare earth minerals to the new battlefield for Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. We're camping out in the glaciers that are changing our climate and discovering the country caught in the middle of this global tug of war.
This is funny to you, Jet.
It will be funny to you in the future.
Hello.
Hello, deep there.
Jesus Christ.
There's the whale.
Right wheel.
Rather appropriately for the world's largest island, this is the biggest project we've ever taken on. A documentary about the beauty, power, and future of our planet. Coming this summer exclusively to TLDR Party members.